All right. So thank you all for being here. Hopefully the slides will be okay. Things are a little funky for some reason. I view the session I'm going to do very much as a follow-on to Robin's talk from this morning, where she laid out some of the introductory material about research data management, and I am going to talk about building capacity. So in particular, the kinds of things that librarians can do to help support the research data management process, and how to increase the capability of the institutions that you work for and yourselves professionally in supporting research data management. All right, well, let's just do the best we can with this. Here's what I wanted to cover in the 4 sessions of today's talk. The first thing I wanted to talk about was what kind of roles librarian professionals might play in research data management, since my understanding is that many of you are librarians. This is the Library Technology Conclave, and the poll that Robin did backs it up. Then I'm going to present a model that my colleague Jan Chin and I have done. Jan has done quite a lot of research on different aspects of research data management. We've had a number of doctoral students work in that area. And we came up with this model for assessing researchers and institutions' capabilities for doing data management. And so I want to present that to you as a way of thinking about this entire notion of capability maturity. Then I want to focus in on 2 specific topics where I think librarians could play a really very, very helpful role in supporting research data management for their institutions. The talk this morning actually touched on some of these, and so in a sense this will just be going into a little bit more detail, specifically creating metadata and supporting data sharing and reuse. Sound like an okay agenda? Yes? Okay. So let's start. So some of this, I think, is going to repeat a little bit what we heard in the beginning. But I want to emphasize that research data management actually has benefits and is important at all levels of the research process. It's important for the researchers, just organizing their own data so that they can find it when they need it in the future. I had this myself recently, a very embarrassing experience where we had written a paper, done all the analysis, spent I think 6 months on the analysis, sent the paper off to be reviewed, and of course there's a delay in the review process. So there were some months before we got a reply back, and the reviewers wanted to see some changes to the data analysis, and I could not find the files. And I could not figure out, once I found the files, exactly how I had done the analysis. So even someone who does research on data management, I was in the situation of not being organized enough to find the files for the paper and to be able to say how I had done the analysis. And of course, what that means also is that the analysis is not at all reproducible. Not even I could reproduce it. And it's going to be a problem because the journal we sent it to requires data deposit. So we have to prepare a file that we can deposit someplace before they will review the paper. So we are now in the situation of having to recreate and reproduce all of that documentation before it can go ahead. We also have the same problem with not having careful versioning of the data, because as I said, we worked on the analysis for 6 months. It went through about a dozen versions, and just keeping track of which version went with which file, and at the end, which version we actually submitted. And now, of course, that we're working on a revision, we'll have to keep track of the revised ones as well. So, so all of these things are reasons that individual researchers can benefit themselves. So basically, it comes down to quality control. So the first message is, as you're working with researchers on research data management, there are lots of things you can emphasize, but I think you can start with the benefits to the researchers themselves in doing it better, because that's something where the individuals will see an immediate benefit and will be interested in doing it. And again, I'm going to go through the rest of these more quickly because they were already mentioned this morning. Avoiding data loss, making sure you have backups, being able to use the data yourself or for other people, being able to document what you did, and just basically being more credible in your data management. This is also something that was mentioned earlier this morning, that it's also increasingly seen as important to advancing science, that science people used to think of as being built on results. Someone has a result, other people build on those results. Increasingly, we see it as being built on data as well, so that data that's collected for one study can perhaps find its use in another study. The quotation that was mentioned this morning, the most creative use of your data will be found by someone else, I think sums it up. So again, these are things that we talked about this morning. So if you think about this as a force field, where we have good data management practices in the middle, you can see it being pushed by the benefits to the researchers, the feeling that data, if they're paid for by funding agencies, is a public good that should be protected, or just following the rules about the data management, wanting to preserve it. These are all things that push towards better management. But then on the other hand, we also have a lot of reasons why people are not interested in research data management. It's not something which is seen as directly leading to results, and as a result, researchers often have different priorities. They would sooner work on the next analysis as opposed to cleaning up their data. The nature of the data itself might make it hard to share. So for example, I do a lot of work with interview data, and interviews are difficult to see how you would share them, just because they often contain a lot of personal details that are hard to share with other people. It has to be said that in a lot of disciplines, there's just a lack of culture. Data sharing is not something people historically have done. Many researchers recreate what they learned in grad school, and if their advisors didn't share data, then that has never become part of their practice. But then an area where actually something can be done. So a lack of knowledge and skills is something that we can try to address through better training and support. And of course, this was also mentioned this morning. There may be legal reasons why data can't be shared, ethical reasons, commercial exceptions. So these are things that are pushing back. So some of these things, like the culture, people having other priorities, hard to see exactly what to do about it, but at least knowledge and skills is something that we can address. So one thing I want to emphasize is that librarians might have an important role. They have a knowledge of and networks within different disciplinary communities, so they can actually see across different groups. They can provide a liaison between different interests, so the researchers, but also the different kinds of support that's available. They often have good negotiation skills to help people see places where they can work together. LIS people often have strong professional networks where best practices can be copied from one institution to another. I think a lot of this morning's talk actually is a beautiful example of that, taking the best practices from University of Edinburgh and bringing them to this group. And in fact, meetings like this are also, I think, really demonstrative of the ways that LIS professionals share best practices. As well, librarians tend to have contact with students and researchers in a sort of a different mode. People are used to looking towards librarians for help and seeking support, and librarians are used to giving that support. So that's a much different kind of relationship to build on. Information professionals generally have good information management practices, and you can actually understand research data management as a kind of information literacy. So just the way you would support information literacy about papers, you can support it about data. In many cases, librarians are the ones who are leading the charge around open access, and data kind of fits in with that. And the thing I really want to emphasize is that there's a lot of skills and knowledge that librarians bring which you may not think of as being research data oriented, but which really can translate. So what that means is there's a number of library roles that can support research. Some of these you may actually already be doing to support research. In fact, actually, we can do a little poll. So offering advice about funding sources, helping people find funding. Conducting literature reviews, doing current awareness alerts around the literature. doing information literacy training, supporting research excellence reporting, helping people support their researchers in identifying what they've done, doing bibliometrics, a bunch of things that are in support of research. And some of these actually do touch on data. So for example, offering data analysis advice or offering advice on archiving. And what that leads to is an expansion of that historic support for research into other kinds of research data management roles. So for example, being the lead on setting data policies, or at least being involved in setting data policies. Bringing data into undergraduate learning. So if you're teaching undergrads already about information literacy, adding something about research data management is a nice addition to that. Or teaching it to postgraduate students. Generally trying to increase researchers' awareness of their data, even helping with specific areas. So one thing that was mentioned this morning was work on developing research data management plans. And so that's actually a nice example where a library service could be set up that would actually support researchers in developing data management plans. Having people who have expertise in those sorts of issues providing advice. On the other side, explaining the impact of sharing data and helping people learn how to cite data. So very often, information literacy courses teach people how to do proper citation of academic literature. So it's an easy extension to cite data. I'm going to go through quickly through some of these other ones. Doing auditing to help identify which data sets could be archived or which need research management. Developing data collections, right? So in many cases, people have topical collections of resources for a particular field of science. So having collections also of pointers to data. Just documenting what kind of data sets the institution has, and promoting data reuse. So I am going to try an experiment. I was inspired by Robin this morning, who was using Menti. So I've tried, this is my first one, to do a poll to see what kind of roles you see. So in particular, I'm curious which kinds of things on that list you think you could actually already do, which ones fit best with what you're doing working, but also are there ones that you think that your libraries would not want to take on? So let me stop sharing this for a minute, jump to the poll. So I have just opened the poll. So you probably didn't get a chance to write down the thing, but you can go to menti.com and use 98843282. And we'll do it in 2 parts. So first of all, roles that you think you could do right now. And we'll do like a minute. So this is a big experiment for me. I've never tried it before. Okay, metadata creation, data literacy. Is it just that the system is slow? Data management archives in standard format, so that's a good one. Research data management awareness, okay. I hear more typing than I see things appearing, so I think all the bits must be going off, coming back. Research-based learning and data literacy, data management planning and awareness, data preservation, metadata tagging, classifying, and abstracting, information literacy skills, and data literacy. Okay, that's a good list. Collect data, management, provide collected data. Oh, it's not scrolling, is it? Training researchers on using bibliographies. Data literacy, and all right. So that's excellent. Can I go to the next slide just by doing this? Yes, all right. Are there roles that you think your library should not take on? This maybe is a more difficult one to think about. Troubleshooting the data repository, high budget projects. Well, but if there's high budget, then there should be a lot of money to support the library, right? No? More technical roles, that makes sense. I still hear typing, so maybe I'll let it go for another minute or two. Only being the data keeper, right? So that actually, if you're not adding value, if all you're doing is holding on to bits, then maybe that's not a good role. Data cleaning, yes, that makes sense. Encouraging unethical work. Okay, I would hope so. All right, so I'm going to switch back to my slide at this point. Yeah, so all excellent ideas. This actually, I should say, I'm borrowing heavily from a project in the UK called RDM Rose, who have a CCC BY on their slides. So that was the attribution. So some of the things that came up in other discussions were leading on an institutional data policy because, of course, librarians already have a role in open access, supporting training, right? So a bunch of things that we talked about earlier. And the thing I want to emphasize is that many of these things actually do draw on competencies that librarians already have. And rather than do another poll in the interest of time, I'm just going to skip to some of that discussion. So for example, in terms of advocacy, since librarians have already been doing this, they often have an understanding of how to influence people towards certain policies. In terms of doing the literacy training, most researchers are steeped in their own disciplines and understand the kind of data that they have. But librarians often have a broader view and can actually look at best practices from different fields and see how those would apply in other areas. And maybe bring fresh thinking to a particular discipline that has not thought as much about research data management from the perspective of other ones. In fact, actually, I mentioned my colleague Jan Chin. She had a very interesting project at Syracuse working with physicists. And it was this interesting contrast that in some parts of the data management, the physicists were extremely advanced, in particular in the way that they dealt with the data from the instruments. So that part of it was very, very organized, very well done, very carefully managed. But then when it came time to do analyses on the data, the analyses were not controlled at all. It was basically a succession of doctoral students who would each do their own study. They would create multiple different analyses that basically sat in their home directories on their own computers. And when they graduated, all knowledge about what the analysis was would go away. And the reason that that's problematic, of course, is that what gets published is not the raw data, but the analyses. And so they were in the same situation I was, where someone would ask about a particular analysis, and they wouldn't be able to necessarily find the files that did it if the doctoral student had left. So that I thought was a nice contrast between being extremely disciplined in some areas and in other areas basically not having any discipline. Providing an advice service, well, librarians are trained in how to do reference interviews. So those same sort of skills to help uncover what people's needs are for data management and then be able to match them with different approaches could be useful. Providing advice, libraries all have websites that provide all kinds of different resources, and so adding pointers to data resources is kind of a natural add-on to that, because there are increasingly large external data sources. I'm going to skip some of these in the interest of time. Making known what's known. Most libraries are in the position of having to market the resources of the library, so marketing data management as well. But then some things which I really want to emphasize. So this idea of actually helping people to put their data in a repository, which requires creating good metadata. Metadata is the bread and butter of a lot of library practice. If you think about cataloging, that's basically creating metadata for books, articles, and so on. So librarians understand the importance of metadata. They understand metadata formats. They understand the kind of discipline it needs to do it. They understand controlled vocabularies and why those are important. And those are all things that carry over into creating metadata. Similarly, in terms of developing and managing access to data collections, that's a natural add-on to collection development or digital library management. So again, knowing how you assess the needs of different stakeholders and identify resources to match them, really very natural extension to doing that for data as well. And then a slightly newer role in terms of doing something local about data curation. So in many cases, I know at Syracuse at least, it's the library who runs the open access system. And libraries have historically been the ones who are involved in preservation. And so extending preservation from physical books and artifacts to electronic documents. For example, the kind of document archives that a lot of universities have, and now extending it to data as well is a kind of natural connection. Oh, thank you. So, questions or comments about that before we move on? Does that resonate, or do people have issue with some aspect of that? Things they think, really aren't suitable? That was the previous question. People are good so far? Yes, in the back. Oh, he needs a mic. Oh, you wanted water? Well, too bad. You have the mic. You need to comment. So what do you think? Make sense?
Water. We wanted water.
Yes, but I'm putting you on the spot. So since you have the mic in your hand, what do you think? Do these make sense as rules for librarians, or do you think it's just totally crazy?
It makes sense. It makes sense.
Okay. Did you want? No, you also wanted water. Okay. I'm going to leave that there. I'm going to skip the next slide. Well, so the thing, of course, to realize is that while there are lots of opportunities, there are also lots of challenges for librarians. In many cases, the libraries are already overtaxed. They've got a bunch of stuff dumped on them already. There's all kinds of other challenges in supporting research. It may also be difficult to get up to speed in a new area, to actually become experts in research data management as well. One, I think, which is really interesting is gauging how deep of a knowledge you have to have of the research area to be able to support research data management. So if, for example, you need to be an expert geologist to help geologists manage data, that's going to be difficult. Librarians are not necessarily the ones who are going to be able to do that. But on the other hand, it is the case that most librarians have subject experts already, people who support, for example, collection development in a particular area. So I think the interesting thing here is sort of carving off the part where having some knowledge of the area is enough to be helpful without having to necessarily become, the expert in the area. There's also going to be a bit of a gap between library practices around things like books and journals to research data, and that's part of what courses like this can help. The complexity can actually also be an issue because, for one thing, different disciplines have really very different information practices. And so just being able to understand where things apply and where the differences make a difference. And in potentially at least research data management can cover everybody in the institution, right? And so that implies being able to think of services which really can be marketed to everybody. And then on the flip side, I think another challenge is that researchers don't necessarily look to libraries for this expertise. The perspective that the researchers have of what the libraries may be able to offer may not include research data management. That engagement may not be there. So you can certainly see places where it's very successful, where the libraries have been able to make a clear demonstration of the value that they can bring. But often when people say, I'm trying to do something with my data, they would instead go to, for example, the computer people, because computer people, data seems like it goes together. And at some level, I think that's true, but there's a lot that would be missing. Computer people tend to just say bits are bits. You gave us some files, we're good. Some of the understanding about access, preservation, description would not necessarily get conveyed that way. And of course, to support all of this, you need to find the resources, get the infrastructure, get the people, set the policies. And so all of that is kind of a non-trivial amount of work. But that's something that we can at least sketch out today what that would look like. All right. Questions or comments before we go on to the next topic? Yes, Robin. Oh, here, you should have a mic.
Okay, I just wanted to comment. I don't disagree about the contrast with computing people, but it's important to work together.
Yes, exactly, because as we saw in the earlier slides, there's a bunch of things that libraries probably shouldn't be doing, like running server farms, dealing with the networking issues. So those kind of partnerships I think are really important. But then there are things that the computer people are probably not going to be interested in doing. And making sure that they know that so that they're not unaware that it needs to happen, I think is important. So like you said, setting up partnerships.
I can understand the RDM and everything, but can you, sir, please focus on something, how this can be implemented in the corporate library, where research is not that core area. For example, I am working in a law firm library. So how I can be useful all these facets, and in my firm, even I am also part of the knowledge management team, where I am responsible for giving meta tagging to the documents, where we are creating a database of the lawyers, those who are working on different documents, they submit the documents, and whenever any other lawyer requires that document, we can submit and we get the reversion of that document. So how we can think of RDM in law firm library? For me, research is a little bit different.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. So part of the issue about research data management generally is that there is such a diversity of what counts as research data. And often you think of it as being huge quantitative data sets, right? Just rows and rows and rows of numbers. And I think your point is that we have to think about it more broadly to include more kinds of creative output. And the kind of briefs that the lawyers are creating, in a sense, is an example of that. So if you think about the data lifecycle, which Robin presented earlier, you can kind of map the creative process of the lawyers into that. And I think the thing that you mentioned, for example, of getting documents and making sure that they're properly described with metadata, that they're preserved, that they're made accessible. It's not a big spreadsheet of numbers, but you could actually almost imagine the FAIR principles applying. But also in a corporate setting, you have this interesting overlay of the data access, that in a sense the data aren't going to be open, they shouldn't be open, that you're also managing who has access to it at the same time. So that's kind of an interesting addition. Anyone else want to suggest approaches that would work in those sorts of data? Because I'm sure that many of you have more experience dealing with diverse data than I do. I only know my own data at some level. Does that make sense? Oh.
What when the major confidentialities are there in the data? How that can be
If the data have certain confidential elements?
Yeah.
So one of the things that actually Robin mentioned in terms of the repository they run is that they actually do have a protected enclave. And one of the nice things about some of the repository software is that you can actually set up different levels of access. So for example, things that are totally open, anybody can see, that they're only open to people with certain authorization, and increasing levels of protection for data that require it. So an example in the US context would be health information about patients has to be specially protected. And so you can actually have a repository that has those sorts of features. But then again, what that raises is not just the technical aspect of it, but also the managerial aspect. So how do people identify that data? How do you guarantee this sort of chain of protection as it goes from different stages of the research and from different systems to different systems? And so I think it's important to think about these in terms of the kind of data and what it demands, the kind of technical protection you can provide, but then the management and policy overlay to make sure that you're actually taking, using the technology to do the protection. And again, I think this is a place where not all librarians, obviously, but that kind of thinking process around assessing collections, maybe more of an archival practice, assessing what's in it, what kinds of protections are required, and then having clear policies in place. And so that policy setting, I think, is an important prelude to a lot of this. Okay, so let me actually at this point go on to my next set of slides, which are about this competency framework. As I mentioned, this is a joint work with my colleague Jan Chin. It was actually supported by a woman whose name is on the citation I'm about to give you. Jan has done a lot of very nice work around research data. She literally wrote the book on metadata. It's in its 3rd edition. It just came out. So definitely someone's work to look up. And if you would like to see the document in question as I am talking, I will leave this URL up for just a minute. Surface.syr.edu. Surface is the Syracuse University repository. It's actually a project of the Syracuse Library. Obviously, the technology is run by the IT department. So an example of the kind of partnership we were talking about. And the document in question is ISTPub, so Information Studies, Publication 184. So since you all have computers in front of you, you can actually see the document. In fact, it looks like, what does it look like? Oh, I quit the program. Is this going to be embarrassing if I do this? Oops, that's not it. I suppose I could just click on that. All right, I'm not going to pull it up. Okay. So the way we created this was, so the goal of this was to help create a framework that institutions and individual researchers could use to assess the maturity of their research data management processes and practices for research data management. Capability maturity is defined as basically repeatability or predictability of the process. So we say that we have a mature process if, when we start the project, we have some confidence that it will finish on time and as expected. So an immature process is one where every time you do it, something different happens, and as a result, you're never sure what's going to happen the next time. And a mature process is one where when you start, you basically have some assurance it's going to work at the end. So this was an idea that we borrowed from computer science, or rather software engineering, because the software engineers had this embarrassing history of failed projects where they would set off to write a system that did something, and sometimes it worked great, and other times it didn't work at all. So that kind of predictability was really important. And what we did was to pull in research literature on research data management and our own experience writing about research data management to create this model. So the CMM is structured in this interesting hierarchical format. So basically at the bottom we have key practices. And so one of the things that we did mining through the literature was to identify a large set of key practices that have to happen for data management. And this morning's workshop actually touched on quite a number of those. So things like choosing document formats, or creating metadata, or doing backups. And we then divided these. First of all, they're grouped into key process areas, of which there are 5. But there's this interesting intermediate level of what are called common features. Common features are basically, you can think of them almost as stages in a project. So things that have to happen before the project starts, things that enable projects to be successful, things that you do during the course of the project. So I'll talk about that just a bit. And then we also view these at different maturity levels. So just to go through these one at a time, the different key areas that we divided the processes into was just general research data management, but then data acquisition, processing, and quality assurance, data description and representation, data dissemination, and repository services. So in a sense, this is a simplification of the research data lifecycle, of which Robin actually showed 2 versions. I think if we were doing this again today, we probably would have used the data lifecycle instead of these, but this is what we came up with at the time. The common features are a commitment to perform. So that's basically, for example, setting up policies, setting up mandates, identifying stakeholder needs. So things that indicate that the organization is committed to this area. Ability to perform are things that you do in order to, well, as I said, have the ability to actually carry out those things. So hiring personnel, setting a budget, providing training. Then the activities performed are the things that actually happen for that particular process area. In the original CMM, there were then 2 other areas, measurement and analysis and verifying implementation. When we were putting together the model, we found that those actually were not very common. So we just put them together as process assessments. So the idea that not only are you, preparing to do things, actually doing them, but you're then checking how well you did them. And I think that's an interesting area for development in research data management. In some ways, the concept is, I mean, it's not that new, but it's still new to a lot of people. And so the idea that you actually measure how well you're doing it is still to come. So just as an example, we might have this goal, reliably capture and describe research data management in a way that facilitates preservation. So the key process area is in this data acquisition, processing, and quality. And some of the key practices are capturing the data, so that's a activity performed, preparing it for storage, analysis, and distribution, but then something about validating the quality. So actually checking that your data were captured correctly and of high quality. So that would be that fourth one, the process assessment. Make sense so far? I know this is all a little abstract. So just to make it really concrete, here are some general things about data management, and I refer you to the document because the document has a nice paragraph or so about each one of these, or a couple paragraphs. But as an example of commitment to perform data management, like the organization is going to perform data management, some of the key practices we identified there are identifying the stakeholders. So who are the different stakeholders for data management? So the researchers are an obvious one, but there could be others. Developing the user requirements, and actually establishing quantitative objectives. So for example, how long should data be preserved for? What is the necessary quality level of data that's being collected? What is the uptime requirement of a repository? So those might be metrics that you could identify. And also policies around communication from the research data management to the stakeholders. Ability to perform includes things like setting a budget, identifying the staffing, identifying collaborations, doing training, getting a suite of research data management tools. I don't think I talk about it in this talk, but each of the stages of the data lifecycle have increasing numbers of tools to help support them. So identifying the particular portfolio that you want, and establishing a data management plan. So this is more at the level of a single project. Right, so you can see how all of these things are not really doing data management, but they're creating the capacity to do it. So, if you don't have a budget, then it's going to be hard to really do anything. If you don't have staff, if the staff aren't properly trained. So these are all things that set the stage. Then in terms, and this is just at the general level again, so managing the requirements, managing the collaborations, actually creating plans, developing workflows and procedures for doing data management. And then in terms of process assessment, actually at this level we didn't identify anything very specific. It was more putting in place measurements and verifying that these things had actually been done correctly. I'm going to skip that. So the second one that we identified was data acquisition, and processing, and quality assurance. So you can see that the first one was just about research data in general. This is really focusing in on getting the data. So for example, having data quality control policies, data documentation policies. So one of the things I think that Robin's talk made very, very clear is that when you think about doing data management, you really want to start at the beginning with a plan and really envision the final product. And in particular, if you're thinking about sharing data, which is something that I'll come to in a bit, the time to think about sharing data is not at the end after the data are collected. The time to think about it is actually before you collect the data, because it will emphasize the importance, for example, of the kind of documentation that you want to collect along the way. As the data are being collected, the documentation is also being created. And something actually which is not on this list is human subjects agreements, for example. So I'm most familiar with the US law, but in the US law, if you collect data from people, they have to give you permission. And very often, the form they sign says that the data will be kept private, never shared, et cetera, by default. That's just the default. That's the default agreement that you give to users, which means that before the project even started, you have decided that you're not going to share data, which means that you can't then very easily later on decide to do some kind of data deposit. So I'll go through some of these other ones fairly quickly. So data file formats, actually, I will talk about that in a little more detail later today. The data quality control procedures, so how are you actually going to check data when it's collected? Then, of course, the main activity is actually capturing the data, but also the data documentation at the same time. So again, I think that's one of the things that Robin's talk made really clear is that you shouldn't think of metadata as something that gets added to data, but that data and metadata get created at the same time. The process assessment here can be a little more specific, so things like actually checking the data quality. So if you have some kind of data collection process and there's supposed to be quality checks, then you can actually verify how well those are working and that the data really are of the quality you want. And it may also be that you're planning to integrate your data with other data from other sources, and so you can actually verify that that's happening. The third area we described was data description and representation. So this actually, we're going to spend a bit more time in the third session talking about ways of creating metadata. But actually developing the policies around metadata, picking or adopting particular metadata schemas or metadata specifications. So I'll have more to say about that in a bit. Selecting tools. There's a number of tools for creating metadata. So settling on which ones you want. Identifying ways to create the metadata that are going to fit the communities. And actually, so this is an area where, again, knowledge of the research domain is important because different domains have preferences for different kinds of metadata. Figuring out the staffing, who's actually going to create the metadata, and then making sure that they're trained as well as the researchers and the librarians in how to do good metadata. And that may involve assessing what the community standards are about that. The activity performed here is actually generating the metadata. So for example, documenting the variables, the files, the study, and then of course verifying that it actually happened, that you actually do have metadata. And then lastly, the fourth area was data dissemination. So data sharing policies, policies around data rights, data confidentiality policies, actually to that point. So you'll see that a lot of the commitment is going to be around policies. And right, so that is, I think, something that librarians are well suited to really contribute to, is thinking ahead of time what the policies around data should be, and really working out how those policies are going to work for all the different stakeholders. The ability to perform may be getting the technologies that actually do manage the access. So that was something we talked about in answer to that question, that there are repositories that you can impose different kinds of constraints on, and those could be useful. In here, in terms of the activities, it would be things like identifying which data products there are. So actually, thinking of them as something that can be shared. Doing work to encourage sharing. Doing the work to enable data discovery. So Robin mentioned that if you describe your data in a particular way, Google will find it, and you can then do a search using Google. So that is one approach. Relying on Google to do everything isn't maybe the greatest idea. So there are other ways that you can enable discovery, distributing the data. One I think I like a lot is ensuring data citation. So making sure that the data are actually citable, and also educating people about how to cite data. And of course, those can also be measured. And then the last area is in terms of repository services and preservation. So actually developing data preservation policies, like what data get preserved, how long do they get preserved for, how do you de-acquisition data, what are the implications, developing data backup policies, that's more around preservation, and data curation policies. So again, a lot of policy work. A lot of this has a technological basis. One I think that's really important is having business models for preservation. If you decide to set up a repository, then you have to figure out how you're going to pay for it. And business models for repositories are actually really tricky, right? Because you're essentially promising people that you're going to take care of their data for some period of time, which is going to be an ongoing expense. And so trying to figure out what the business model is that people will still be willing to deposit, but that you'll actually be able to support that ongoing expense can be problematic. Developing backup procedures and training, that's another ability. And then the activities are things like storing the data, providing security. Over lunch, Robin was saying that she actually has a number of slides about data security that she didn't cover this morning, but which are in the deck that you're going to get from her. A really important one for science data is controlling changes. So people may want to make changes to their data files when, for example, they discover errors and correct them, but having policies around how that happens, because people may have downloaded an earlier version, making sure the data are backed up, doing the curation about what to keep and what not to keep. Another one to think about is data migrations. So as you go from successive generations of technology, you may have to do migrations. My own personal story about that is I can no longer open my PhD thesis because my PhD thesis was written in Word 3.0, I think. Word, whatever we're up to, does not open Word 3.0 files. And so at some point I upgraded to a version of Word that would no longer open my thesis, and I did not save it in a new version early enough. So this is actually part of the reason why open data formats are so important. A lot of researchers think that if they upload an Excel file, it's good. But Excel files also have been evolving over the years. And so you could easily imagine, a few years down the road not being able to open Excel. PDF has so far avoided that. But at some point you could imagine that really early PDFs will no longer open. But proprietary data formats are really awful for that. Anyway, so those kind of migrations, it just requires being super systematic, right? Going through your collection and saying, okay, they're about to get rid of this version of the file, and we have this many of them, and who's going to go through and open them and save them all into a new version, and then check that nothing broke. Yeah, so process assessment, some amount of measurement and analysis, but one that I really emphasize is validating backups. It's amazing how many people discover that their backup stopped working 2 years ago, only after something crashes. So just periodically checking that the backups are really backing up is important. Okay. So the last piece of this is the capability maturity. So up until now, we've been sort of describing the different practices, and the thing is that for each one of these practices, there's going to be some routine for doing it. Except actually, it may be that those routines are only at the level of an individual project. They don't have very clear documentation. It's done kind of intuitively. If the people doing it are skilled, it may be being done very, very well. And if those people leave, it may be that that skill goes with them and nobody knows exactly what they were doing. So that's level one. Level one is initial. Things are managed intuitively at the project level. A nice description of this was things work through the dint of personality. So if you have the right person, it works okay, but there's no guarantee. It has to be said that research data management in a lot of cases is at this level. The example I gave earlier of the doctoral students working on their own research projects, level 1. They're doing stuff, nobody really knows what it is. Sometimes it's great, and a lot of times it just is. Level 2 means that the process has actually been characterized at the level of the project, sometimes in a reactive way, but it's at least being managed. So for example, the project has written down processes for one or another of these steps. For example, if we go back to this one, the project has a backup practice, right? So somebody has said, here's what needs to be backed up.
Please switch off your mobiles.
So backup, level 2 would be at the project level, we have a backup policy. At the project level, we're storing data. So the PI for the project says, I'm tired of not being able to find things because it's in people's home directories. We're going to set up a structure someplace where we're going to have each of the projects named, and there's going to be a README file. It's all going to be in one place so that we know where it is. We can back it up more easily. So that would be an example at the project level. Or if I go back to this previous slide, the project has its own metadata scheme, right? So that's actually pretty common, that we have described what's in each of the files, but it's basically just a text document that people in the project wrote, and other people in the project can read it, but it's just at the project level. So the good news is that things are actually documented, and that there's perhaps some repeatability, but the bad news is that it's being done at the project level, which means that as people move from project to project, whatever they learned on the previous project doesn't necessarily transfer. When someone new joins the project, they have to learn everything from scratch. And as well, you're not taking advantage of the best practices. So it may be, for example, that people have learned a lot about how to do data quality assurance, but whether the project actually is taking advantage of that or not is not so clear. And this also makes it very hard to provide support because there's a lot of variability in what people are doing. And so in order to support them doing it, you have to learn a lot more about the details of what they're doing. Level 3 defined means that that characterization of the data management is now being done not at the level of individual projects, but at the organization level perhaps, or at the discipline level. So a nice example here is in the biosciences, where people deal with genomics data. So in the field of genomics, for various historical reasons, they've become very, the data management practices have become a lot more standardized. So for example, there's a particular way that you describe a genome data set that everybody who does genomics knows. They can, as a result, do it fairly quickly and easily. There's a set of repositories that everybody knows about, and the practices for depositing data in those repositories are all well known. If you are a student in genomics, you just learn those as part of your training. And if you move from lab to lab to lab, it all goes with you. Similarly, for backup, for example, you could imagine that instead of having every project have to figure out its backup on its own, that would be a service that the institution provides. That if you put your data on the research data platform, then there's some guarantees about the backup, so that, again, individual projects don't have to recreate that. They can just take advantage of what the institution's providing. In some ways, the repositories that I mentioned are an example of that. So, for example, with papers, rather than every faculty member having to manage his or her own website of papers, the university just has a place where you can put things. There's a fairly easy process to deposit them. There's good support, right? So that has been institutionalized at the university level. So that's the big distinction. So it's not that, one of these is more or less defined. The question is, where's the definition coming from? Is it something where the researcher, him or herself, came up with it? Or is it something where they can draw on this broader community to help define it? The last two levels we actually did not see very much in research data management. And I think this is a place where there's an opportunity as more professionals get involved in research data management. So level 4 means that you're actually doing measurement. So for example, you're setting quantitative goals for the different aspects of the process. A simple one, which is not very interesting, would be what the uptime is for the repository, right? That you would actually have a target, that the repository should be available some percentage of the time, because then you could measure how often does the repository go down. So that's one where I think setting the goal is very easy. Seeing how you would measure it is very easy. With some of these other areas like data quality, what should the goal be for data quality? You'd have to have a pretty lengthy discussion with the researchers about that. How would you know whether you were achieving that goal? So I think that line of thinking about research data management in the future is a place where professionals who have a view across many different projects will be able to really provide some insight. Where is it important to have quantitative goals? How do you actually measure them and assure that people are meeting them? And the reason that that's interesting is it then leads to the possibility of level 5, which is optimizing, which is to actually be looking at the processes and saying, so here's how we're doing it today. Here's the kinds of outcomes we're getting. So can we think of ways of fine-tuning the processes so that we are constantly improving our performance on the metrics that we agreed on? So you can't do this until you actually have metrics and you have measurements. And right now, for most of research data management, we don't really have metrics or measures. So honestly, getting people just to level 3, or even in some cases just to level 2, is, I think, just that by itself would really change a lot of people's lives. But, we can aim higher. So let me give you an example of how that might look in practice. So here's a key practice, managing the user and technical aspects of requirements through elicitation, documentation, validation, and negotiation. So basically trying to find out what it is that users actually want about their research data management, which is one of the activities performed for this process area of developing user requirements. So in other words, one of the ways you develop user requirements is you do this elicitation, and it could be in a particular organization that's managed, meaning that research data management, there's some kind of research data management group in the library perhaps that actually has a standard process by which they do this kind of elicitation. Which means that going into a new project with a new set of PIs, it wouldn't be a case that you had to sort of figure out what to do. There would be a standard approach that you took to doing the elicitation that people had been trained in, and they could just do it. Maybe I should stop for questions since I've been talking for a while. And I know I covered a lot. So this idea that research data management has a bunch of process areas with a bunch of practices that people perform. I think that probably makes sense, but questions or comments about that? The part that might be a little bit stranger is this idea of thinking separately about commitment to perform, mostly setting policies that say that we think it's a good idea, ability to perform, things like budget, staffing, training, infrastructure, so the pieces that you have to assemble in order to be able to do it, a set of activities that you then perform for that process area, and then things that you do to check that the activities were performed correctly. So in a sense, that's just a sorting, but it's one that I find very useful because it's things that you do for the organization sort of once, and then maybe update, things that you have to do more or less continuously to have the capability in place, and then the things that are actually happening, day to day as the project is unfolding. And then the piece which I think we need to think more about of measurement and assessment and validation, so that it's not just that we did something, but we're checking to see how well we did it. That's good? People feel comfortable or have questions? And then the last piece is, where do those practices get written down? Is it they're not written down at all, people just try their best they can, which is honestly the state of a lot of research management, data management, that a particular project at least has documented what their standards are, or that there are standard approaches for doing things either disciplinary at the discipline level, like as I said, for genomics, there's a lot of real standardization around research data, or perhaps at the institution level, where the institution has standard ways of dealing with things. Nope. Nope. Okay, so in the document which I gave you the pointer to, which hopefully people have had a chance to look at, one of the things we did, and this was Adrian Kirkland, our third author on that paper, who did all of the really hard lifting about this, was to actually create rubrics. And the rubrics were just for 0, 1, or 2, because basically we didn't really see, we saw basically no examples of 4 and 5. Even 3 was pretty uncommon. So, so what she did was, for each one of these areas, for commitment to perform, ability, activities, process assessment, she wrote basically a little description of what it would look like. And so this is a very generic one where, for example, with commitment to perform, the practice is not being observed. No steps have been taken to establish organizational policy or senior management sponsorship regarding stakeholder end user needs, quantitative objectives, or communication policies. So this, if that applied to you, you would basically check off that box. And then contrary-wise, for example, ability to perform, structures or plans, training, and resources such as budget staffing have been recorded for the project, but have not taken wider community needs or standards into account. So that's level 2. So remember, level 2 is, it happens at the project level, but not at the community level. So I'm not going to read all the words, but basically in that document, we have rubrics like this for each of the process areas. And so the goal is to have a tool for actually checking the key practices against the maturity level, which would give a research group or an organization a way to kind of benchmark themselves, to say, where are we doing well in terms of having research data management practices at a high maturity level? Where are there opportunities to improve the maturity? So let me give you a case example. We were interested in project level data management. We had a team that had 2 faculty members, a PhD student, and 3 master's students working on it. And what they were studying was, this is actually going to be very meta. They were looking at the metadata in a large data repository and then trying to translate those into a form that they could use to answer their research questions. And the research questions were about the kind of collaborations in the field and how those were reflected in the data that was being created. So they were downloading all of that data, parsing it, they loaded it into a relational database. They did some checking for anomalies to verify the quality of the data. They wrote various programs to analyze the data and output those. And so as a result, they have output including the pre-processed data, the output, and the compiled data. So the question is, how is this group doing in terms of its research data management maturity? The thing to note is that one of the two PIs on the project was actually Jan, right? So if anybody was going to have defined processes, you would think that it would be the person who wrote the capability maturity model. But what we discovered was that some of them were in fact at level 2, so they were at least managed. So for example, the stakeholder needs were recorded, but there wasn't anything at a broader level. Budget and staffing, again, were recorded. So for example, there was common decisions about how to use Evernote, how to document the programs that were created. They were all properly documented. Actually, Robin mentioned that this morning. There was a choice of a shared space to store documents in, but only at the project level. In fact, they were using Google Drive. The workflows were actually fairly well defined, but there was no assessment. So there was no assessment of how well the project was going on. And actually, I thought I had another slide, which was the stuff that was not at that level. But I think you can read between the lines. These were the things that they thought were documented well. And the kind of implication is that almost everything else was not actually all that well documented. Okay, so I want to do a little exercise since I've been talking for a long time. And I was going to do it in Menti. But it does require a little bit of work on your part. So how many people have actually opened the document that I gave you the pointer to on Surface, the full RDM? No one. Okay, then I will put the slide back up. But before I do that, let me open the Menti. Oh, that's not the right one. All right, so let's do this in two parts. So we're going to do this part first. So this is which RDM practices do you already perform or that you already support. So the number is 70951341. So as soon as people have got the Menti open, I'm going to switch back to the slides and go through the practice areas so that you can see if there's one that you recognize that you think that you're involved with or that you have some connection with in some way. All right, so let me go back. So I'm just going to go through these quickly. And if you spot something and you say, oh, yeah, yes, we're involved with that. Or we would like to be involved with that, or we've talked about being involved with that, then you can jot it down in the mentee. So people understand what we're doing? So some kind of research data management practice that you're already involved in. So this is just general kinds of stuff. Here are things around data acquisition, processing, quality assurance. So this would tend to be things that the scientists themselves are probably more likely to do, but maybe data file formats you've consulted on, for example, or policies. Perhaps you've been involved in policies. So here are some things about data description and representation. So metadata for data files. So maybe providing training around metadata, or looking at what the community uses for metadata. Data sharing policies. Yeah. No, either one. The next question actually is at what level is that? So something which you're doing at all, and then the next question will be what level you're doing it at.
This is either of one.
Yep. Yeah. Just that you're doing it. Or you know people who do it. Or you've heard of it being done. So this is around data dissemination. This is around repository services. So assessing a business model for preservation. Actually, I could ask Robin. Robin, Edinburgh, what's the business model for the repository? How do you keep that thing going? Okay.
We're fortunate that the university values what's being done enough to
So
give us
basically,
money.
it's an internally funded service.
It did evolve. It started off with external funding as a project, and it took us a while to kind of seed the repository and get a lot of data sets in. Like I said, when people start seeing that person down the hall has done it. So it kind of has a curve like this, where the first few years we were just pulling teeth to get data sets, but then now it's really taken off.
And as it's taken off, the university has decided that funding
That
is...
It's
but
valuable, yeah.
Right, but it's funded as kind of an overhead.
Yeah.
Okay. So the business model is overhead. All right, so let's go back to the mentee. Whoops. And see... So practices, people are level 2. Work in progress, measurement and analysis people are doing. Actually, I'm curious about that one. I'm curious what you're measuring. Data presentation through SPSS. Data acquisition, Mark 21 format. Metadata for the institutional repository. Information literacy skills trainings using citation management tools. Data acquisition someone's involved with. This does not seem to scroll by itself, so let's see. Data collection, storage, and analysis. Metadata. Actually, who said metadata? Data creation. No one's going to fess up. So yeah, that's actually, I think, one where the library could be really useful. Oop, you guys broke the projector. Setting policies for adding data to the repository, storing institutional data. Actually, it's an interesting point. You could use it for institutional data as well as research data. Data discovery, data acquisition. Excellent. So let's move to the next question. Actually, I'm going to expand this. There we go. So which of these do you not already support, but you think you could support? Places where there's an opportunity for the library to get involved. So I'm going to switch to the slides again so you can see. So repository services, perhaps, something that the library might pick up. Data sharing policies, maybe, or distributing data. Metadata, various kinds of things you could do around metadata. This one maybe not quite as much. Data management in general. All right, let's see what people have had to say. So institutional repository, storage of primary data, metadata, data discovery, sharing and collaboration, data sharing policies, institutional repositories. Yeah, actually, so I'm going to talk a bit more about that one in a bit. Data sharing and preservation policies. Actually, there's some nice overlaps in these. So a number of people talking about repositories or other kinds of data distribution or data discovery, and data sharing policies. Actually, so that leads in nicely to the thing that we're going to do after the break, which is to talk about metadata and to talk about sharing data. All right, last mentee. So this is a new one. So it's going to have a new number. Did you have a question, or are you just stretching? Okay, so this is a new number. You're going to have to open a new mentee. It's code 2030 4054. 20304054. So this is sort of a follow-on to yours. So the research data management practice you think you perform, what level of maturity is it? Is it level 0? 0 means it's not happening. So if you're doing it, it's not 0. 1 means it succeeds through personality and heroics. So good people can get it done. People stay up late and they get it done, but there's no reproducibility. It's not documented at all how it's supposed to happen. So if it does happen, it sort of is despite the, and level 2 would mean that it's defined at the level of the project, and then level 3 is that there's some organizational standard or disciplinary standard. And so again, just as a reminder of the kinds of things that you might be working on. Yep, and then a break. Okay, so back to the mentee. Oh, what happened to it? 1, 3. Data are curated in institutional repositories using DSpace. Yay! So someone's at level 3. Data acquisition is 3. Data sharing level 2. Repositories level 3. But a lot of level 1s. So I think that was basically what we found in our examination, is that in a lot of cases, research data management is just not very well understood, not very well documented. It does happen, but there's no guarantee that it will continue to happen. And so the interesting role I think librarians can play is to help individual projects move to level 2, but really to be putting in the thought about what it would mean to be at level 3. Like, what would it mean for research data management to really be a strong capability of the organization, such that when you go to start a new project, it doesn't start from scratch, but it has a set of research data management practices that can be drawn on to help ensure the success of the project. All right, so thank you for that. Let me not do that. Let me go back to my presentation. Oh, and as I said, the document that that hopefully you've downloaded actually has the rubrics for all of these that you can actually try to apply. And if you do try to apply them, we'd be super interested in hearing your experiences doing it. I think I mentioned this. Level 4 and 5 is just like, how do you actually measure what you've done? How do you verify that it worked well? But because we're getting ready for the break, let me just sum up. So what the CMM is basically this catalog of key practices. An added keyword is process assessment, the idea that you could actually use that to identify places where there are strengths and weaknesses, and then make process changes to replace the weaknesses with strengths, as well as performing some kind of an assessment of the strength of the organization. And the level of maturity is basically a way of assessing where there are weaknesses that might be interesting. Just to wrap up, I want to acknowledge that the work on this was funded by a grant from ICPSR, the Intercollegiate Consortium for Political and Social Research, as well as the Alfred Sloan Foundation. All right, and so with that, it's time for a break. All right, I'm going to continue with some topics where I think librarians have a particular role to play. So the first of these is around metadata, and the second is around data sharing. And in the talk this morning, Robin actually laid a lot of the foundations for metadata. So this may go relatively quickly. And I've borrowed heavily from Day1. Day1 is a project that I spent 10 years working on, unbelievably. And one of the things they did was to create a lot of very nice training materials around research data management. And those are on the Day1 website, and they're CC BY, so I am acknowledging the role of Day1. So anything that says Day1 I got from them. So I want to explain what metadata is, say why it's useful, look at what's actually in a metadata record, talk about metadata standards. Actually, Robin already did that, so this will go quickly. And then some tips about actually how to write metadata. So what is metadata? So in the data lifecycle, metadata is basically this box here, the describe box. So the idea is that you've done your data management planning, as Robin talked about. You've collected your data, you've made sure that it's quality, and now you have to describe it before you can preserve it. So basically data about data. Who created it? What's in it? When were they created? Where do they come from? Day1 was about ecological data mostly, so a lot of it is very located on the Earth somewhere. How were they developed? why were they developed, and you heard mention of the FAIR principles. So one of the FAIR principles is that the data are described with rich metadata. So why is it important? Because basically it captures what the information is in a format that's accessible to humans, but also machine readable, so that you can actually do something with it programmatically. And one of the things you can do with programmatically is you can actually catalog it, so that you can actually have a catalog of your data resources. So much the way cataloging information helps you to have a library catalog of all the monographs or other resources in the library, because there are standard fields and standard descriptions and controlled vocabularies that are used that enable cataloging. Exactly the same idea for catalogs of data. And Day1 actually takes this a step farther by supporting exchange across repositories, which I will show in just a sec. So metadata are actually valuable to data users in a bunch of ways. If you want to be able to search for a data set or evaluate whether the data set is what you want metadata, right? Because the data itself is not going to be useful for searching. It's not going to be useful for assessment. The metadata is what supports that. So finding the data, again, the metadata. Deciding if it meets your need, again, the metadata. How to acquire the data set, how to actually process it, and understanding what the data are about is all from the metadata. And metadata is really important if you think about data over the life cycle. So at the time the data were created, that's kind of like the point at which has the most value to people, right? Because we've just created it and we're starting to use it. And over time, the specific details kind of disappear from people's memories. They're left with some general idea, like, for example, the story I started the class with, where we submitted a paper based on some analyses, and at the time that the reviewers asked for changes, it's like, yeah, what did we do exactly? So we knew in general, but the specifics had already started to vanish. Of course, at some point, there might be an accident, and the data basically lose all of their value because they get destroyed. But inevitably, people change careers, they retire. The person who created the data is no longer around. Even on a shorter scale, a very typical thing is that the doctoral student who was involved in the project graduates. They go on to their own career, and the PI who employed them to work on the project is left with the data set, but without the doctoral student. Or even more morbidly, the person actually passes away and nobody knows. So the goal with the metadata is to make sure that the data have a value in and amongst themselves. Just to give you an example of a negative example, this is something which you now see increasingly frequently in publications, at least in certain disciplines. Not the peer review history, which is interesting. When we talk about open science, we can talk about open peer review. But the data availability statement. All the data are available at, and then a DOI, right? So they've actually deposited their data. They actually got a persistent identifier, a DOI for the data. The problem is that data have no metadata whatsoever. So when you go to the website, all you see is that there are 3 CSV files. And then if you look at the CSV files, all that's across the top is, a set of, words. Cat, regional, clim, n, num, hec, an, whatever that means. And then numbers. So no indication of, what the data are about, what the units are. So you will not be astonished to hear that this particular data set has no downloads and no citations, because what would you do with it if you downloaded it? As Robin suggested, the author would probably say, oh, well, it's all explained in the paper, right? So the paper is the documentation. But what do you notice looking at this page from the repository? Well, no paper, right? No link to the paper. No indication that this data are about a paper, right? So it's very much one way. The paper points at the data, but the data by itself are pretty useless. And actually, honestly, even the paper itself does not explain enough to be able to make use of it. So this is very much lip service, right? Data must be made available. Oh, okay, so we'll upload it. But that doesn't mean that we have to make it useful to anybody. Okay. So a proper metadata record is actually contentful and fairly structured, and we'll actually talk about the kind of things that would go into one later. But this just gives you an example, which you can't read at all. But, you know, information about how it should be cited, information about who published it, information about where to actually download the file, a description, in this case an abstract, a purpose statement, you know, why were these data collected? So just a much, much richer add-on to the data itself. And the data are useful through all kinds of different phases, to the developers, the users, to the organizations themselves. For the data developers themselves, the metadata can be useful to make sure, for example, that they don't have duplicate data. If they know what the data file is, they can very easily verify, you know, that it's the most recent version. I was, again, I'm confessing to my really bad data management habits, but just going through my data files, I realized I had two versions of something, and it was like, you know, which one is the most recent? Are they just copies that I made for some reason? So I haven't got the proper metadata to be able to tell. But it also enables sharing, which is what we're going to talk about in the last section. And sharing should be viewed as a way for scientists to burnish their own reputations, right? So historically, that was based just on publications, but data is now part of that equation, and metadata is what makes sharing the data possible. And basically, it saves time and resources in the long run. So part of the issue there is it's basically an investment of time now to save time in the future. And if there's one thing we know about human psychology, it's that people are really terrible at making those investment decisions because they can see the costs today of how much time it's going to take, and they vastly underestimate the benefit that it's going to create in the future. And so part of the conversation around metadata is basically overcoming that basic human psychological discounting of the future, right? To point out that, you know, the time spent now really is going to pay back in the future. Sorry about the thing flashing on and off. Hopefully it'll stop in a minute. But metadata are also useful to organizations, which is part of the argument for having an organizational capability to support creating metadata. So part of it is, you know, this documentation, as I said, so moving up the capability maturity levels to level 2. Being able to reuse the data is something which is supported by proper metadata, but also being able to track use. So one of the points about having DOIs on data and having proper metadata on data is that you can actually then start to track who else has used it. And that leads into the process of data citation, which we'll talk about later as well. It offers the possibility for the data to become more permanent because it actually is more self-contained. You don't need to find the data author to be able to use the data, but other people can also use it in the future. You basically are contributing to the organizational memory. And in a sense, it burnishes the organization's reputation as well, so that they're, the output of the organization in terms of data is being detected. Wow, this is super annoying. I hope it stops. Okay, so how does metadata play out in resource data management? So part of it is, as I said, in the description phase. It's also used to support identifying, accessing, data in the reuse phase. So if we go back to the data lifecycle, it's created here, but it's really critical for this discover phase. Oh, I have to go through this entire build again. Okay, so where was I? It's also important for building catalogs. Actually, we already mentioned this, but here are some examples if you want to start looking at examples of data catalogs while I'm talking. Unfortunately, these are mostly European or US resources, but actually search.data1.org has data from around the world. More data from certain parts of the world than others, it has to be admitted, but that one actually is a bit more global. This one is US. Actually, this one is also global, Metacat. Data1.org, geo.data.gov, that's the US government. Data.usgs.gov, that's also the US government. So for example, the advanced search is basically supported by the metadata fields, right? So you can only do an advanced search for things that are in some kind of a structured format. So that's the kind of thing that the metadata is supporting. So for example, to be able to filter by location, and say that we want India, right? So let me just pick one of these to show you. Right. So so basically, this is the metadata. So the metadata is a separate file that you can download, typically in XML or JSON. This one I think is XML. I'm not positive. But you can see that it has an abstract describing what the data are about. It's got the geographic locations where the data were collected. So India, Kazakhstan, and Siberia. Actually, you probably can't read that. Let me see if I can expand it. Right, abstract. It's got the publication date. It's got the geographic region. It has the investigator who deposited it. It has rights holders, like whose information is this? That came up earlier, right? How do we know whether we can share? How do we know whose it is? Well, it says the person who submitted it is this, but the person who owns the right is Dryad. Anyway, you get the point. There's a lot of information that's available to support someone trying to understand the data. So that actually was about the metadata file itself. And if we, and if we scroll down, we also have, oh, actually we don't for this one. I take it back. All right, let me go back to my presentation. Yeah? Yes, but you should get a microphone.
Sir, I'm Pavana Jyoti from IBS Hyderabad.
Mm-hmm.
I belong to Finance and Accounting Department.
Okay. Finance has lots of very structured databases.
Yes, sir. So my question is, just now you opened a database and it is published in the year 2018.
Mm-hmm.
So how can we say it is relevant as on today if I want to do some research? It's 2022,
Oh, well,
and
so,
2018 data is outdated, right?
Yeah. What is the key concern that people have these days about the environment?
Whatever it is, whatever is the area,
No.
Of research.
What's the sort of...
my question is related to the life of the data, not about
Yeah.
the life cycle of the data.
Right.
But life of the data.
Right.
See, if
So,
I'm doing a research in the year 2022,
Yeah.
if I'm using the data which is published in the year 2018, that means it is older data.
So
How
what's like the major concern that people have about the environment today? Could it be climate change? So how would you know what the effects of climate change were if you didn't have historic data? So part of the point about having these complete data sets is that you can actually look at change over time. So what was going on in the oceans
Okay, comparison
in
of that
2018? Yeah.
data with the present data. So I have to again collect the present data.
Yeah. And very often people are doing various kinds of models. And so one of the things you would do is you would collect, the model data. You would train your models on 2018, right? And then you could feed in more current data and have the models tell you what's going to go on presently. So historic data are super important for those sorts of comparative studies, but they can also be useful for, like I said, for modeling, that if you want to understand how different parts of the environment are connected, it doesn't make that much difference when the data are from. If you can, for example, connect data about rainfall with data about plant growth, with data about certain kinds of insects, and if it's all data from 2016, you could still work out what the relationships are, and then that model might be useful going forward. So part of the, and actually that's true even of financial data, right? That part of the people people are doing modeling still using 2016 financial data, because what they're interested in are these sort of patterns in the economy, and
Okay,
it
understood.
doesn't make as much difference, so you modeled it in 2016, but you can then project forward. So, yeah, but this question about the data value is, I think, an interesting one, because it leads to the need for data curation policies, right? Like, how do we decide which data are worth saving, which data aren't worth saving? Probably in your institutions, you've had conversations about, how long should you keep stuff on the shelf? Is there a point at which you say, yeah, that book from 1800, who's going to read that? And I think most librarians are fairly conservative about that, because I think most are modest enough to say that they don't really know that they can predict what people are going to want in the future. Something that seems uninteresting now, maybe 20 years from now will become important again. And that the point of an intellectual heritage organization is to really preserve the heritage. So I think data has a kind of similar conversation, right? Which is, are people going to need data from 2018? We, don't know. There is a cost to keeping it around, but it may be that cost is pretty minor compared to the possible future benefits. But definitely policies for data curation where you say, okay, at some point, we're not going to save it anymore. Actually, Robin, is she here? No. Right. Actually, so this is kind of in point, is that the metadata records are also important for the provenance, and one of them are the data current. Maybe there's a more recent release of the data that should supersede this. Actually, Robin mentioned that in her talk, that sometimes they take data out, but it's because there's been a new release of the data set, and you want people to use the new release instead of the old release. what format are they in, where are they stored? And actually, this is also interesting, like, who do you contact about this information? Where are there new derivations of it? In principle, the metadata will actually also have enough information about where the data came from that somebody else could do something similar. So, the methodologies by which the data were collected. One of the things I find interesting in ecological sciences is that people will often specify the model numbers of the equipment that were used, right? That they collected water samples using a particular collection approach, and they measured a particular characteristic of the water using a particular model of the instrument. Because that tells people a lot about how the data were actually created, what the definition of the variables are, the various parameters, which means that if someone questions the data, you actually have this backup that says this data set came from this source collected in this way, right? So it's not just we have some data, but we have data and we have a process that created the data. So again, tying it back to the maturity model, you've moved yourself up a level. It's not just we have a data set, but we have a data set that has a defined process for having created it, and that defined process is actually captured in the metadata. This may also help to avoid certain kinds of misuse. That you have a stated purpose, what the data were intended to be used for, which means that other uses of the data, it's clear that that's not what the data were for, so you can avoid inappropriate applications. So that's actually a concern scientists often have about sharing data, is that it will be used inappropriately. So you can actually say, it should not be used for this. It may give you indications of completeness, so what was included in the data, what's not. And actually, interestingly, you can also expressly state what liability the data producer takes for the data. Usually that would be, we don't take any responsibility. People use this data at their own risk. Of course, metadata have a lot of advantages, but there are a lot of concerns. Anyone care to guess the main concern about metadata? If you had to guess, what would be people's main concerns about metadata? Sorry? Creation. The creation date? Oh, the creation. Yeah. But what about the creation?
Quality.
The quality? Yeah, actually they should be worried about the quality, but the main, of course, would just be the time, right? It just takes a lot of effort. Like when you saw that long list of things that were involved, that's a fairly substantial amount of writing. Now, in some cases, it's writing that has already been done for another purpose. So, for example, it may be that the abstract to the paper describes what the purpose of the data collection was, and so you can just grab the abstract and stick it in the metadata. It may be that a lot of the methods for collecting the data are part of the method section of the paper. So again, you can just grab it out of the paper and stick it in the metadata record. And in fact, Robin was saying that in some cases, they just put the paper in, and they say the paper describes the data, that's the metadata. The problem with that is that it's not very structured, so it's not machine readable. It's only human readable. So other parts, though, are going to require a human to go through. So for example, describing the variables properly. So there are some solutions to this. It does create work to do the metadata. So the point is that you should know that ahead of time, right? So it shouldn't be, oh, we created all this data, and now at the end of the process, we're going to do metadata, but rather that the data creation process includes creating the metadata, right? So that way, people aren't having to recreate what they did, but they're simply recording what they did as they did it. And actually, that also distributes the effort of creating it over time. So I have to say, this is one of those things that even though I put it on the slide, I find it difficult to convince myself. So I create lots of data files, but I don't create metadata at the same time. So it does require a bit of change of workflow. But again, that's part of the point, is that at the point where you're planning the workflow, when you're setting things up, you set it up to say, yes, we're going to collect the following kinds of data. And here's the process by which we're also going to create the metadata, so that the metadata and the data get created side by side. It takes time and resources to create, so put it in the grant budget. Actually budget money for creating metadata. Make sure that you have hired the people not only to do the data collection, but also the data management. So I don't know the situation in India, but I would not be at all surprised if the Indian authorities have made the same conclusion. Certainly in the US, there's a requirement that grant proposals include data management plans, and you can budget for that. So you can say, in the data management plan, we're going to create the following kind of metadata, and you can put a line in the budget for how much that's going to cost to do. This was in reference to the quality, how usable are the metadata. So one of the advice here is to actually use a standard metadata format, because that way, it'll be useful to people. And often people say, oh, well, but my data are so unique. They're really unlike anyone else's. But the point is that most disciplines have actually invested in creating metadata standards. It may take a little bit of research to work out which one is the most appropriate, but the chances are that there is something that someone has thought of, that people have unique data, but it's not so unique that no one has ever thought about it before. So as Robin mentioned, there's a bunch of metadata standards. These basically are a way of structuring the description, so common terms, common definitions. So basically a common way of putting together the metadata. Actually, if you think about books, what are some common metadata standards for books? Anyone here a cataloger? Sorry? Mark, yes. So Mark is a metadata standard, right? And in a sense, I think it's been superseded because my cataloging training is decades old, but Anglo-American cataloging rules, right? Basically tells you how to create metadata for monographs and things like monographs. So those are examples from the book world. An example in the data world, that basically you have a set of defined elements, and it includes what kind of type the person should enter. And then there's a set of elements that are defined for the data set. So obvious ones are things like title, abstract, keywords, right? So those are kind of the basics. So as Robin was saying, they insist that people at least include enough that you can write a data citation. So what do you need for a data citation? Author, year, title, where to retrieve it, right? Sorry? Source, right. Yeah, so that's kind of really, really minimal. And you will notice that that would not be enough to support discoverability, because it wouldn't tell you, sorry? Yeah. It wouldn't tell you, for example, which geography. Like you notice that I searched for data sets about India. So that wouldn't be included. It wouldn't tell you which species, if it were data about species and so on. So that's why there are richer metadata standards. Other ones that you might know are Dublin Core. That was created for web resources. There are a bunch for doing geospatial data. And then there are some, and these ones focus mostly on ecology because Day1 is an ecology project, but there are similar lists for other ones. So ecological markup, metadata language. Darwin Core is an interesting one. It emphasizes describing museum species, geography. Just to give you a sense, Dublin Core is usually in XML. So remember before I showed you a CSV file where basically all there was a CSV file? So imagine you had a CSV file like this, which was a row number, basically, the name of a species, and how many of them were observed at a certain period. So you might have a metadata file that tells you where to download the file. So that adds the location, but then describes what each one of the fields is. And the way it describes it is by reference to a controlled vocabulary, right? So in this case, the controlled vocabulary is coming from the Darwin core, and it tells you, that the first column is an occurrence ID, the second is a scientific name, the third is an individual count. And those terms are then defined in the Darwin core. So if somebody wants to know, so what does it mean, individual count, then that's located there. But then as well, actually it's not on here. You can add things to the metadata that add the additional information for the whole data set. So the location where it was captured, the time and date it was captured, the author, and so on. So this is a very, very minimal one. All it does is describe the columns. But basically, you can add the same kind of additional markup. So right now, this is just describing the file. All right, so how do you actually choose a metadata standard? And so actually, this is, I think, a place where a data librarian could be really useful to make the researchers aware that there are metadata standards and to help them to navigate which metadata standard might be appropriate for them. But it would depend on things like the data type. If it's GIS data, then there are content profiles that are better for geospatial data. If the data come from satellites, then again, there's better ones for that. So part of it is the kind of data. Part of it is what the organization policies are. You might have standards that people should use something. And then also what kind of tools are available. So for example, if you decided you wanted ecological metadata language, then there's actually a tool called Morpho, which helps you to write that. So that could again be part of the support is, not having people just do things in XML, raw XML, but actually doing it with a tool that's customized for doing certain kinds of metadata. I'm going to go through this really, really quickly because a lot of this I think is fairly consistent with practice in the library world. So for example, making sure that commonly used fields are actually using a controlled vocabulary. So don't use acronyms for things, but use full names. Standardize your dates into a common format so that the date field is always interpretable. It gets Americans in particular into a lot of problems because I don't know if people know, but in the US, the dates are almost always written month, day, year. And in most of the world, they do day, month, year. And scientifically, it's typical to do year, month, day, right? And so if you're given a date and it's just 8 numbers, how do you figure out which one it was? Or even if it's printed this way, month, day, year, that could be really uninterpretable. Keywords, often there are controlled vocabularies. So using the names out of the controlled vocabularies as opposed to something random. Right, so using authority files for the data. So very much like doing keyword cataloging for books, right? There are these standard controlled vocabularies, spelling out acronyms, making sure that you're complete, that you have, all of the data about the whole resource, all about the attributes. Data quality is an interesting one, like how accurate are the data? So someone just looking at the data set wouldn't know, but you could actually put in the metadata information about the accuracy. So just as an example, the originator, publication date, the title. Oh, actually, yeah, Robin mentioned that people have trouble coming up with titles for data sets. But, being more specific is better, right? So not just data or CSV file, but like this one, estimated altitude of the consolidated rock surface underlying quaternary sediments of the Wood River Valley Aquifer System, South Central Idaho. So you'll notice that it not only has, what the data are, but the location it was collected. It wouldn't even be unreasonable to put the date in, what data was collected. And that can be both human readable as well as machine readable. Defining, in the case of the one I showed you earlier, what all the columns are, what data type they are. This is information about the accuracy of the data. So, which data were included, which data weren't included. Sometimes there'll be gaps in the data record explaining why certain data were left out. For example, there was a malfunction with the equipment, or it was out of range, and so people decided not to include it. There's actually an interesting story with ozone data, that the initial collection of the data started rejecting certain values as being out of range. And so they would show up as gaps in the record. And then at some point, people realized that there were a lot of gaps in the record, and they went back. Because they had the information about how the rejection had been done, they were able to see that the data collection process actually was masking a rise in ozone layers. And that, when you went back to the original data, you could actually see the ozone just going up. But it's only because the data were documented at the level of why were certain data points rejected, as opposed to just leaving gaps, that people could make that recognition. So data lineage, like where did the data come from? How was it actually collected? And then I think very interestingly, access constraints, like who's allowed to see it, who's allowed to use it, who can actually, what kind of constraints there are. Robin mentioned the CC licenses. So that could actually be in here, right? Users are free to use, copy, distribute, transmit, and adapt the work for commercial and non-commercial purposes without restrictions, as long as clear attribution of the source is provided. In other words, CC BY, right? So these days, you could actually do this a lot more concisely. This is a CC BY record. All data are considered to satisfy the quality standards. No warranty, express or implied, is made regarding the utility of this data. So that could be something you could put in there to specify what kind of liability you assume. And that, again, could both be in a human and machine readable format. And then, of course, making it citable. We already talked about that. But yes, identifiers, DOIs, maybe editors, maybe if it's part of a larger work. So data citation actually is this interesting and growing area, and I think this is almost the end of my talk. But the notion is that if researchers get credit for publishing, and they get credit for their work being cited, they should similarly get credit for making their data available, and they should also get credit when people use their data in the form of data citation. So that is something which is clearly a work in progress. In some fields, it's pretty well established. In other fields, people are like, what? But as an example, in a lot of cases, if you go to a repository, right, and so this is replication data for a particular one. So this is an example where the title is basically the journal article. They actually give you a citation, right? And not only that, but you can click on the cite data set. And just like for a journal article, you can download something that you can load into a reference manager in order to be able to cite the data. So that makes it really clear to people that you want to be cited, and makes it really easy for them to then cite it. So they can say, we used a particular data set, Basu and Kartik 2022, and in the reference list, there'll just be a reference to the data file. One of the nice things about some of the repositories is that when you upload your data, it will actually assess the data against the FAIR standards. So when Robin had you look at that, you probably noticed that there are, 45 something? There's a lot, 51. And so it can actually tell you that you're 73% complete on findable, 50% on this, only 33% on interoperable, right? And actually, 10 tell you which of the criteria you're not meeting and what you would have to do to fix it. All right, so I think basically at this point I'm going to stop because I think I've said more than enough. The one thing I would say though, just to finish, is it shouldn't be the case, that describe just happens here at the end. I think you really want to think about metadata as something which is being continuously created throughout the process of the research, so that when it comes time to share your data, or not to share the data, but just to preserve it, that you have a good metadata record already there. So with that, let me stop talking about metadata, but see if there are any questions or comments before we go on to the final topic. We have a mic, if there are questions. So as I said, one of the reasons I think metadata is a good topic for this audience is that it's something that, that makes sense to people with a information management background, that is difficult for other scientists to really grasp, and it's a place where that kind of education and support can be useful. There is a question in the back, though.
As per your view, who is the best person to create the metadata? Either subject expert or the mediator like a librarian?
I think it has to be a collaboration because it's different kinds of skills, right? So I don't think the librarian could do it without the subject matter expert. But equally, I don't think putting it entirely on the subject matter expert is going to work very well either.
What we had realized when we are doing the same exercise in our firm, the subject expert is least bothered about giving the metadata. They don't want to waste that time on that thing. They only pass out the document and the rest is on us. So in some cases, as we are not the subject experts, we are getting difficult to understand the document.
Well,
so that's why I asked you this question.
Yes. So I think the second part of what you said exactly illustrates why it needs to be a collaboration. And the first part of what you said is why metadata often doesn't get created or gets created badly, is because the people who have to contribute don't perceive the value. And so that is definitely a problem. It's not one that has a really straightforward solution. Part of it is training and support about why metadata are important. Part of it is making it as painless as possible so that the person doesn't perceive it as being very onerous, or encouraging people to plan for it so they know that it's coming and they build it into the process. Part of it, honestly, is sticks, right? So for example, in a lot of the ecological sciences now, people won't publish your paper without a data deposit, and repositories won't take a data deposit without metadata. And so there's a real stick, which is if you want your paper published, you will create the metadata. And honestly, sticks are sometimes necessary, right? So in your context, what that might involve is getting some kind of managerial support that says, here's why metadata are important to the firm, and therefore why it should be important to individual lawyers, right? That it's not optional, it's necessary. But by the way, we have support to make it easy for you, and you're not on your own. You just have to do the things that only you can do, and then other people will do the things that they can do. But it does take a combination of those things, right? It's not like you can just assume that it's going to happen otherwise. So yes, excellent point. But I really do think that that part of the point about data planning is data management planning is thinking ahead to, we're going to deposit, we're going to need metadata. So how do we make sure that we're capturing what we need to capture in an ongoing basis, as opposed to struggling at the end to try to make it happen? So good questions. Where is my final set of slides?
Sir, I have one question.
Sure.
So with regard to the consistency, you said consistency is one of the criteria or parameter for a creation of the metadata. So what is the yardstick? So maybe for accuracy and completeness we can have, but I'm confused about consistency.
Oh, well, consistency would be things like naming institutions in the same way. So, for example, if you're thinking about the publisher of a data set, and it was named in 4 different ways, then if someone were doing a search, they would see 4 different variations on the publisher name in the search list, right? And so part of the way you avoid that is you use controlled vocabularies, right? So there is a standard way to name the U.S. Geological Survey, and you use that standard name all the time, as opposed to sometimes saying U.S. GeoSurv, United States Geological Survey, U.S. Geological Survey, right? You can see how you would end up with variations. And so part of the answer is you use controlled vocabularies to make sure that you're doing things consistently. In a sense, metadata standards are another way that you get consistency, right? Because you always use the same format for description. So especially for the machine readable fields, that kind of reuse of terms is really important.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, so let's talk about the final topic, which is data sharing. Actually, Robin already started the conversation about this, so this is just adding a few details. One thing that we realized looking at the data life cycle, collect, assure, describe, deposit, preserve, this is the Data1 life cycle, is that the preserve is very often being done for other people's discover, right? So it's not the case that I preserve things and then I have to discover them myself, right? I preserve things so that other people can discover. And so that brings up this notion of data sharing. So like, why do we share our data? Given, as we've heard, it requires all kinds of other effort, it requires resources, it requires faith in other people. And part of the argument is that it basically benefits the public, who get the benefit of their investment in the research sponsor, the rest of the community. And all of that stuff is great. But the problem is that that's other people. So you also have to convince the researcher that he or she stands to benefit from data sharing, because otherwise we have this real mismatch where the researcher has to do the work so that other people benefit. Sometimes that's okay. There is this notion of generalized reciprocity. I do my part so that other people can benefit, and they're doing their part so I can benefit. But often, the people who want the data and the people who have to share the data are different. And so that generalized reciprocity kind of breaks down. But for the public, just having the openness about the data, I think is useful, that they perceive that they're actually getting something, and more importantly, that the research is being done in an open way that is more trustworthy. The research sponsor benefits because it basically enhances the value of the investments, because it means that the data that they paid for are not just benefiting one person, but are perhaps benefiting an entire research field. It also allows them to, for example, verify some of the outcomes, like how much data were collected, we can actually see it. Promotes advancement of the science if the data are actually used for other things. Maybe reduces data duplication. Once one person has collected the data and other people can use it, we don't need to spend money collecting it over and over. The scientific community can perhaps benefit because they can actually build on the work of others. And again, just repeating Robin from this morning, the most creative use of your data will be made by someone else. It also supports interdisciplinary research. And interestingly, the possibility of doing meta-analyses. So meta-analyses are those that actually draw on multiple studies and aggregate the data to draw more precise conclusions. As well as supporting increased transparency, reproducibility. See, these are all things that Robin said this morning. But the point is that we also have to look at the benefits to the scientists, which do exist. One is that they may get recognition from their sponsor as being someone who is authoritative about a certain area and who made good use of the money. The data quality may actually be improved because if there's one thing we know, if someone's going to be looking at your work, you tend to check it a little bit more closely. You know, if you're going to make the data available to other people, probably that's going to include an increased investment in making sure the data are of higher quality, opportunities for exchanging data with other people, and for actually being part of an enhanced network of people who are working on this data. But of course, when you talk to scientists, there are lots of reasons why they don't want to share. And actually, this is an area where there's been a fair amount of research about why people sometimes don't want to share. Actually, if you had to guess, what would people say about not wanting to share? I should have made a needle thing, but people can just say. Actually, Robin mentioned a bunch of these, so this is a quiz. What did Robin say? Sorry? Competitiveness, yes. I spent a bunch of time and effort collecting this data, and I want to be the one who gets the benefit of that data.
Misuse.
And misuse. People worry that the data will be misused. Actually, that's the first one on the list. Inappropriate use, either deliberately or because they don't understand what the data are for. Another one we heard this morning was that the data are confidential. You know, I can't share those data. Those are confidential data. I won't get credit for it. You know, people will do stuff with it and I won't get any credit. And I'll lose my advantage, right? I'll get scooped. So what is the solution to this? So one solution is metadata, right? So a lot of the stuff we talked about doesn't completely solve the problem, but at least it's a way to address it. So in particular, you can help to avoid inappropriate use by actually providing information about what the data are supposed to be used for. So that doesn't help if people don't read it, but at least you have made the effort to say, the data were collected for this purpose, they have the following limitations, you know, it's good for these things, it shouldn't be used for these other things, and so if someone continues to use it that way, you know, they at least were informed. The metadata, by the way, doesn't have to include the data, right? The metadata is a separate file from the data. So you could make the metadata available and not the file. And then the metadata could say, here's who's allowed to access this data and here's how they would get access to it. So if you're worried about the data being confidential and only available to, you know, people who have passed some kind of vetting, you can still make the metadata available so they know what it is, and then people who want it can contact the authors and negotiate for the access. The lack of acknowledgement, you know, the metadata can include a required data citation, so that if the data are used, it has to be cited in a certain way. You know, does that guarantee the data will be cited? Not really, but it no more than, you know, the fact that someone has a journal paper that's clearly citable guarantees that they're going to be cited. But in both cases, if people don't do it, then it's actually an ethical violation on the part of the person who didn't cite, right? If you quoted something from a journal article without a citation, people would call you out. If you use a data set without a citation, again, people should call you out. And then the loss of advantage from getting the data first. So one thing you can do is you can actually create versions of the data where, for example, you don't go into as much detail about the methods. If the method is what's special, you could do this, you know, tell people what kind of data there are, but they have to negotiate with you to get access. So there are still things you can do to protect the proprietary, the ability of the owner to benefit from the data. And actually this morning we heard a bunch of other things to consider. Who owns the data? That can actually be very complicated to work out. What kind of restrictions might there be? So things that I had never thought about before, but often people have data about endangered species that they don't want to publish because basically they're trying to protect the endangered species. In particular, like certain kinds of endangered plants, if you let people know where they are, collectors will go and grab them, which is not the goal of studying endangered species. And of course, human subjects. So one interesting thing with data about human subjects is that often it's possible to anonymize the data. But this is a place, again, where data management planning from the beginning is super important, because you can actually build into the informed consent documents the idea that some of the data will be shared, so that people know that that's going to happen and agree to it. The default consent forms say that you will never share the data, which means that at the beginning of the study, you've already precluded the possibility. So thinking about it at the very beginning is important. I'm going to skip this because Robin covered this in a lot of detail, but licensing the data is important. To actually make the data shareable, though, there's a bunch of additional steps, and some of them we've already talked about, like describing the data. We've talked along about metadata. Preserving it in terms of storage formats. So again, Robin already mentioned this, using unencrypted, uncompressed, non-proprietary standards to make sure that the data will be available going forward. So for example, with tabular data, using things like comma-separated variable and not Excel. For text data, just using plain text or HTML and not Word. Word is not that great of a source. For media, and so on and so forth, sort of open standards. So things like, actually not JPEG, but PNG. PNG is a more open standard. For structured data, things like XML as opposed to a proprietary relational database. So then the last two I'm just going to cover together, depositing and discovering. Very often with the depositing, increasingly you can actually have the data as part of the publication. You may have seen that there'll be a paper and then it will say supplementary files. And so the supplementary files may actually be the data. If the data was a big collection effort, there's actually data journals where you can publish a data paper, which basically describes the data set and has the data set as an attachment. And so that counts as an article. But of course, increasingly, people want the data in a repository. And journals are increasingly linked to the repository so that you can actually review the data at the same time that you review the paper. And what that means then is that also supports the discovery, because the repositories have search capabilities. So this, I think, is another place where librarians can be really useful, is making sure that people know about the repositories, giving them advice for which repositories might be interesting to search for data when they're looking for data, and to help them pick a repository to deposit data into. In some cases, they actually have additional services, like helping to create the metadata. There's a couple of, it's very meta, databases of repositories. So re3data.org. In fact, actually, if you want, as a little exercise while I'm talking, take a look in re3data.org to see if there's a repository that would fit the kind of research that you're familiar with. Another one is fairsharing.org. So here's an example of a search in re3data.org. It was just to look for repositories in India. And so, for example, there's an Open Government Data Platform India, which is run by the government. There was one for the tuberculosis initiative, but in November 2017, it vanished. It was no longer available. So that's actually a flip side of the repositories, is that they have this responsibility to maintain the data, but business models for repositories are difficult, and so repositories occasionally just vanish. So that's part of the assessment, right? Is is this a reliable one? So there's a bunch that are for specialist data. There's also a few which are so-called generalist. So things like Harvard Dataverse, Dryad, that will take basically data about anything. They have different business models, they have different costs, different features, and so part of choosing amongst them actually would also be balancing those kinds of features. Increasingly, libraries are running their own repositories. Ours does certainly for papers, but they're actually talking about doing it for data as well. And this is made easier by the fact that there's a bunch of open source systems. So you heard Robin talking about DSpace. So DSpace is a very common one. It's the one that theirs is built on. The Harvard Dataverse actually has an open source version, so you can run your own Dataverse. Fedora is another big one. So libraries are often, but not necessarily, the leads, but obviously with support of other users, other groups, right? Because the actual technological infrastructure might be better run by an IT services group. So you could imagine that kind of division of labor where the hardware, the operating system, and even the repository itself is being managed by an IT group, and then on top of that, the library is adding additional services, because it requires a lot, right? There's a technological infrastructure, which is servers, storage, the software, but you also need staff to run the system, and you really need staff to support users, to help them understand how to do the deposit. You need to do training. You may have to set institutional policies for the repository. And of course, all of this is going to require funding. And you heard Robin's story that they're viewed as a important service of the university, so the university funds it. So that's a pretty typical model. You could imagine doing things with a certain kind of chargebacks to departments, but part of the question there is whether that's enough of a disincentive that people won't want to do it. So I mentioned institutional policies. Here are some of the things that you could include, like which kind of content will be in the repository. Is it literally anything at the university? Does it have certain focuses? What kind of metadata is required? Are specific standards required? How are data going to get in there? Are people just going to be encouraged to do it, or is there going to be some kind of a mandate that people with certain kinds of research projects are required to deposit their data? Wow, it got really bad. Rules about access and reuse of data. So you can actually imagine this at multiple levels, right? Totally open, open to anyone at the university, open to anyone in the same research group. Metadata is available, and there's a link that they can follow if they want to request access. All kinds of levels. An interesting one is what kind of guarantee of preservation is going to be given. So I think, if I heard Robin correctly, she said that they define forever as 20 years. So they're not guaranteeing it past 20 years. But, whatever the policy is that you come up with. And also, what are the rules about withdrawal? Can somebody actually say that they want to take their data out of the repository? And if they do, then what happens? And eventually what's going to happen to the repository going forward? Is there a plan for a replacement repository down the road? So these are all kinds of things that could be addressed in a policy, and again, places where the library might actually have a much better sense of the complexity of the problem and the kinds of issues that need to be addressed. So just to summarize, in terms of repositories, there's a set of principles. So you heard about the FAIR principles for data. So there's the trust principles for repositories. So to be transparent about the repository services, to be responsible for ensuring the authenticity, integrity of the data, and the reliability and persistence of its use, to make sure that the norms, that it meets the norms and expectations of the users, to make sure that it's sustainable. So I think that may have been what happened to the tuberculosis one, is that they started it with good intentions, but didn't have a sustainability plan. And to actually provide the technology for secure, persistent, reliable services. And actually, it should be clear that these things are non-trivial, right? Making sure that the data are really secure. If someone tries to hack into the repository, making sure that it's properly backed up, that it has a good level of service and so on. But it could be an interesting part of an overall research data management service where you have a set of policies and strategies. You have business plans to make sure that it's sustainable. You're helping people to do data management planning, maybe helping them manage their active data, deciding what to deposit, some kind of a repository, and catalogs that make it all discoverable. all supported by guidance, training, and support. So a bunch of areas where I think librarians could be really, really useful in supporting research data management. And since it's pretty much exactly 5 o'clock, I should probably stop. But if there are any final questions about either sharing or repositories. Nope. People are stunned into silence. Yeah, so take the mic.
Is there any repository specifically which provides Indian data? Because
Well,
you are actually providing a lot of
the-
resources, I'm just.
Right, the government one is clearly Indian only. When I did the search on RE3, I forget the rest of the URL.
I think there is one for social sciences. As far as I know, there is one other one for social sciences by the social science, that is ICSSR. That is also having a repository for, I mean, I haven't gone deeper into it. They have a repository for social science research. And similarly, there is another for space science also, if my memory serves me right. I don't have it right now. Yeah, there are. You should be knowing, you have done a survey, no?
Yeah.
Raj, you should be knowing.
Okay.
Give him the mic. Here, Shalini.
He has done a survey of repositories.
A couple of years ago, I did some survey on it, and there are 65 data repositories from India are listed on it. But there is no shortcut actually. If you are looking for a data from India, there is no clear-cut shortcut that this is the repository where you can get the data. So you have to specify your objectives, what kind of data you are looking for, and then you have to filter down, and accordingly you can reach to the repository for. So that's actually also a misconception that there is a one single stop shop for getting the data, or one single stop shop to make the data standardized, because there are different subjects. So we need to work actually in a different layers to make our data standards actually. So that's also I think the area of concerns for all the data scientists to make the data standardized.
Yeah, so I'm just noticing here that on the re3data.org, it says it found 44 results, but I don't know if those are all strictly Indian. It sounds like it's incomplete if there's really 65. Right. But the point you raised is actually an excellent one, which is that there are repositories. The repositories all have a particular focus, and and with limited exceptions, there aren't sort of meta searches. And so part of the advice I think that librarians could give is, for a particular discipline, here are some repositories that are probably more appropriate and more likely to have data. And then similarly, if you're looking to deposit, here's how to identify the one that will be an appropriate source to deposit.
Yeah, in fact, there's one more study which says that, when you are getting the data, when the researchers submit the data, so what kind of a repository they should look for repository. So in a researcher actually, they are looking for a data which is the repository which is generic in nature. So even if I have a subject-specific data, I'm going to deposit in a general repository, because the more researcher will seek that repository to get the data. So there are more chances that my data will be cited more if I, deposit my data into generic repository.
Oh, I see. So that would be a reason to go with Harvard
Yeah.
Dataverse as
So that's
opposed
another,
to...
yeah, that's another answer to her questions, that what kind of repository I should look for. So
Right. But it is actually a problem that if everything ends up in generic databases, then at some level more people have a chance to see it, but it's also harder to search because it's not tuned to the kind of data you're depositing. Yeah, so this is actually why the choice of which repository is very non-trivial, and where somebody who is actually familiar with the landscape could probably provide very useful advice.
And that's, I think, the roles of librarians come.
It is certainly one I think that would be a good role. Both on the looking for data as well as the depositing, and then at the very specific level of, okay, so I've decided Harvard Dataverse. So how do I get something ready for Harvard Dataverse anyway? Or how do I do a search in Harvard Dataverse? So a set of skills that librarians already have from other contexts that I think translate really very naturally into this context. Other questions or comments? Nope. Thank you very much for your attention.